Well, good evening and welcome to this evening panel discussion on well-being and the role of government. Can government policy make us happier? The IAEA responded to the government's desire to centrally collect data on our aggregate happiness so that the government can, in its view, try to pursue policies which are orientated towards promoting the nation's aggregate well-being by producing this book, which is called And the Pursuit of Happiness, and the particular title gives a clue as to where the authors are coming from. And now I was debating this issue last week with Richard Layard, who is in effect a professor of happiness economics at the London School of Economics on the Today programme. And he said in that course of that discussion that he thought it was self-evident that public policy should be directed towards the maximisation of the sum of human happiness. Now, Professor Layard has clearly never been to Yorkshire, where people get great contentment out of being miserable. And last time I visited Yorkshire, I went to a comedy club, and in the interval I turned to somebody and said, "That was fantastic, wasn't it?" And he turned to me and said, "I suppose so, if you like laughing." And this is one of the many difficulties with this policy area, I think. Do we know what happiness is? Can we measure it? Can we direct policy towards maximising it, whatever it is? Or do we simply, or should we simply have a government which creates the conditions which allow us to pursue happiness? And to explore these and other issues, I'm delighted that we have, or very happy I should say, that we have a very distinguished panel, beginning with Jessie Norman on my far left, who is the Conservative MP for Hereford and South Herefordshire. Professor, sorry, you're sitting slightly out of order, but Professor Shackleton, who will speak after Professor Norman, who will speak after Jessie Norman, promoted you. Professor Shackleton is Professor of Economics at the University of Buckingham. Chris Snowdon, who is an IAEA Research Fellow and who wrote an excellent critique of the spirit level, called The Spirit Level Delusion, and Jamie Whyte, who is a renowned author and journalist and philosopher formerly at Cambridge University. So, Jessie, take us away.
Right, well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Philip, and ladies and gentlemen. Let me just get myself organised here. You've cunningly devised... No. Okay, well, we'll work it out. That's great. Okay, so thank you very much indeed for having me along today. Apologies, these are not my work clothes. I have not morphed into Steve Hilton, you'll be pleased to know. And I'm going to take a somewhat different view on happiness, perhaps than the one that Steve takes. Let me start in a place you perhaps might not immediately associate with this topic, which is the village or the small town of Colombey-les-Églises in France after the retirement of General de Gaulle, when Mrs. de Gaulle was asked what she was looking forward to, now the general had retired, and said, happiness. What she meant, of course, was the subject of today's discussion. And I think her difficulty, as it were, underpins a general problem, which is one of a philosophical problem of equivocation. I used to teach philosophy, so I hope you'll excuse me if I talk a little bit about this. And it is there that I want to start. So consider then Aristotle's treatment of happiness. Aristotle regards happiness as what he calls the teleotaton telos, that is to say the final goal, the ultimate goal, to which all human action is inevitably attended. In other words, not because it can be achieved by aiming at it, but because it's as it were, the paradox of happiness is that you achieve it as a byproduct of living a full life, and in Aristotle's case, living a virtuous life. So it's an oblique goal, but nevertheless the ultimate goal of human life. And that is, I think, a rather important and interesting insight, which we'll come back to at the end. But let me then move on smartly by 2.5 centuries to Richard Layard, who has been mentioned already as a great happiness guru, and who I regard his work as a compendium of everything that is wrong in thinking about this topic. Broadly speaking, whatever your view, whatever Layard says, the direct opposite is the truth. And so he regards happiness as a science. Well, of course, it isn't a science. Economics isn't a science. In fact, the more we know about economics, the more we know how unscientific it is. So that falls to the ground. His view of happiness, and if you want a more thorough treatment of this, I would refer you to my discussion of it in my book, The Big Society, last year, available at all good bookshops, and also online at this worryingly low price, because his view of happiness is, broadly speaking, that happiness is pleasure. So he has what philosophers call a hedonic conception of happiness. And because he thinks of it as pleasure, and he's a kind of rather unregenerate Benthamite utilitarian, he thinks the goal of public policy is to maximize pleasure, this happiness, and of course pleasure is a mental state. And this is a contrast that we'll see coming out. It's not a state of, as it were, being, it's a state of mind. And so the question then would be, well, why would you want to, he thinks from these insights and from some facts about, or apparent facts about marginal economics, you can deduce important implications about tax policy. But there are two obvious errors. One is, of course, that actually what's really worthwhile is not, as we'll discover, pleasure. No, I mean, first of all, happiness, of course, has 1,000 different meanings, only one of which is pleasure, so it's a very odd gloss on the word notion of happiness. But also, pleasure itself. I mean, I can give this country an enormous amount of pleasure by putting a suitable alkaloid or painkillers into the water supply, but that's not going to give us anything that people might genuinely associate with happiness. And the wider problem is that it is, as economics generally is, and utilitarianism generally is, as it were, neutral or indeed negative on the notion of the self. So it has this idea of the self as essentially passive, a vehicle for the receipt or the, as it were, the expression of utility, or as he sees it as pleasure, but not the self as an active, enterprising, energetic, achieving, as it were, connective entity. So, as a correction to Layard, this book is massively, massively welcome. And its own other contributions I think very, very interesting. I think its contribution, the attack on the Easterland Paradox, I think perhaps the most interesting of many interesting contributions. But I hope I will not be regarded as it were, reducing the IAEA's happiness if I say I have a lot of worries about it. And I have a lot of worries about the way in which it's being targeted at the moment in the political context. As I've said, there is a lot of equivocation about happiness. This book is not exempt from that, and there's a constant shifting in it between happiness, well-being, which I take in people's core intuitions to be a somewhat different concept, and other notions, life satisfaction, and what you might call emotional well-being. And it's quite noticeable that actually, with the exception of this happiness index that the government has somewhat incautiously announced, the Prime Minister, in the speeches that introduced this topic, didn't really talk about happiness. He was talking about well-being more than happiness. And so to equivocate creates a problem, because it takes the target away from the government, which is where it seems to be aimed, and towards, back towards, in a way, towards Layard, which is where it should be aimed. Now, the Easterland Paradox, as you will know, states that happiness has not risen essentially for 30, 40, 50 years, and therefore it can't be the case that any other thing that you can mention that's rising can be a contributor to happiness. It can't be the case on this view that inequality is a contributor to happiness. It can't be the case that wealth is a contributor, growing wealth is a contributor to happiness. It also can't be the case that falling disease is a contributor to happiness, or the absence of world wars, or longevity, or any of these other things. But I put it to you, ladies and gentlemen, that we would all regard those as components of well-being, and that's because they are components of well-being. And government has always been, whether it acknowledges or not, in the business of improving people's well-being. That's why we have the NHS, that's why we have collective insurance, through pensions and things like that. That is what it's about. I also worry about occasional leaps of logic in the book, and factual inaccuracies. I will spare you the detail of that, except to say that the word daimon, contrary to, and this is the boring classicist in me coming out, contrary to page 191, does not mean true nature. A daimon in Greek is a god. Eudaimonia, which is the Greek conception, one Greek conception of happiness, is a state of being favoured by the gods, blessed by the gods. It is a state of being. And it's not a state that can be associated with your mental life. So a Greek would find it completely intelligible to say, an ancient Greek would find it completely intelligible to say that if someone dies and the following day their eldest child dies, okay, that person, even though they're dead, cannot be regarded as happy. Okay, that's unintelligible if you regard happiness as pleasure. But it's not unintelligible if you regard it as a certain kind of blessedness. You would not be regarded as favoured in that way if your oldest child had died the following day, even if you were yourself then dead. So the problem I have then, broadly speaking, is that as aimed at the government, this book is essentially setting up a straw man. It accuses the government are setting up the straw man that GDP growth is the only goal of policy, whereas in fact no rational person believes that, and actually it isn't suggested by what David Cameron said. And then it erects a massive straw man itself, that is to say that central planning of happiness is somehow being taken on by government as a goal. Well, of course, that is nonsense. All that's happened, I mean, you might think, if that was the case, that the government had undertaken some massive Stalinist program of enforcing happiness in which enormous numbers of people were being fed through kind of machinery of vast expense. But of course what's actually happened is the government spent £2 million compiling an index that looks at things other than wealth to go along a lot of other things, which also aren't just about wealth. So that's not what I would call an enormous activity of central planning. And what is interesting is that the Prime Minister's own use, and I'm not holding that, I don't brief for the Prime Minister as such, but just as in point of logic and as a correct analysis of the situation, it's interesting that the Prime Minister's use of the notion of well-being allows him to dodge the Easterland Paradox, because he's not committed to saying that happiness can somehow be improved by government activity. He's just committed to saying we might want to measure these things to see if we can learn some more about them at low cost, and that well-being can be affected by government policy. And again, no one disbelieves that. Not only that, we actually know what the components of human well-being are because we've done a lot of work on the psychology of it: autonomy, mastery, and purpose. So it looks like, and this is why I think Professor Shackleton's chapter is particularly interesting in this book, it looks like things, particularly work-based policies, that increase people's notion of autonomy or the mastery of their own lives or the purpose, the sense of meaning in their own lives, will add to their sense of well-being, and to their sense of well-being. And that is something that I think government can perfectly, properly respond to. Let me wind up quickly then by saying, by enunciating a few small propositions for your favourable consideration. One is that I agree with the view that you cannot achieve happiness by pursuing it, and that's true even for states. You can, however, achieve well-being by pursuing it, and that is true for states too. The second is that I think in talking about happiness in this index and in the Prime Minister's talking about well-being, what he's really trying to do is to make a social and cultural point. He's trying to open up the sphere of public debate to consider a whole much wider range of things than politicians have traditionally discussed, and in particular conservative politicians. The fourth thing is that there is a way of making sense of the evidence as we currently have it presented to us, and that would be that the Easterland Paradox is correct. That the attack on the Easterland Paradox is correct in this sense, that wealth can increase, as it has been found, your sense of achievement. But there is nevertheless a sense in which your emotional well-being doesn't increase. This has been discovered by some of the work referred to through additional wealth. In other words, this is evidence for this idea that actually we are in a slight sense of somehow value withdrawal or anomie. So I think that's a consistent way of accounting for the different phenomena we have at the moment. Easterland Paradox is wrong. Wealth confers a sense of achievement and therefore is positively correlated with well-being, and even potentially in some cases with subjectively reported happiness in certain conditions, and also that there is nevertheless a kind of anomie of wealth and a vacuum of values. Now Burke said that you must govern, this is my final thought, ladies and gentlemen, Burke said that you must govern with the temper of a nation, and I personally am thrilled to be living in a country full of Yorkshiremen who are both ambitious and phlegmatic at the same time, both keen for greater wealth and greater well-being, and also perfectly happy to see no movement whatever in happiness. Thank you very much indeed.
Very interesting. Right, I want to talk a little bit about the economics of this, and particularly how it applies to work. The economics literature on happiness and well-being, and I take the point that these are not exactly the same thing, that they're very much conflated in the literature, and I don't think we're being unique in doing that in this book. The literature on happiness and well-being has reached really quite alarming proportions for anybody who wants to keep up with what's going on. But although this all seems new and very whizzy, of course it's retracing some old ideas in economics. Back in the 19th century, we heard a brief mention of the utilitarians. Jeremy Bentham and his mates saw the greatest happiness of the greatest number as the chief goal of policy. Actually a rather difficult and perhaps contradictory notion. Early economists used introspection and reasoning to reach what at first glance seemed to have been some pretty radical ideas. For example, the view that the marginal utility of income declines as income rises was something which was used by early socialists to justify redistributive taxation and so on. But it wasn't just introspection. I think there was an attempt also by some early economists to tie in with developing ideas in psychology. In 1881, Francis Edgeworth, the Irish economist, imagined a hedonimeter, which would actually, a machine which would someday measure directly the utility or pleasure which people derive from various activities. Nowadays, actually, we're getting tantalizingly close to realizing this idea. Brain scans have shown that there are physical manifestations of subjective states of mind. This is one of the reasons which leads Richard Layard to claim that there is a new science of happiness being born. The other thing, of course, is the amazing proliferation of cheap computing power and huge data sets which have enabled economists and others to draw some fairly interesting conclusions about well-being over many different countries. Okay, but these new developments in the happiness paradigm have not resolved the problem, of course, which did for the original utilitarians. That is to say, the impossibility of interpersonal comparisons of utility. In simple words, we're all different, and what turns you on doesn't necessarily turn me on, or at least not to the same degree. I've been looking in this book at a specific area of the happiness debate, the area of well-being at work, which I think exemplifies some of the problems of happiness literature in general. Now, work is obviously a huge part of most adults' life, and it has a big impact on our overall feelings of happiness, life satisfaction, and all these other things which Jess referred to. To summarise very quickly, the drift of a large part of the academic and policy literature on well-being at work goes something like this. First of all, there is a set of identifiable factors that boost well-being at work. Secondly, workers who are happier at work, that have a higher level of well-being, are more productive. And thirdly, firms which provide jobs which are attractive to workers will benefit from higher productivity and improve their bottom line. These are the kind of propositions which have led, for example, the Department for Business and Innovation and Skills to commission a lot of work, for example, analysing the Workplace Employment Relations Survey to get at this kind of connection. Now, at first sight, these three propositions seem logical and acceptable. However, many happiness economists like Professor Layard go beyond these propositions and argue that there is a market failure in some sense, that firms don't realise the benefits to be obtained from improving the well-being of workers. And therefore government should intervene in various ways, by regulations to enforce improved working conditions, for example, restrictions on working hours, parental leave, employment protection, requirements to consult with workforce, and so on. And indeed, you could classify Nick Clegg's latest wheeze about giving employees the right to buy shares in their companies as part of the same kind of mindset. Now, I wouldn't go down this route. In fact, I think all three of the propositions I outlined to you require considerable qualification. First, the factors which boost people's well-being, their subjective well-being at work, are not as obvious as you might think. They differ markedly between subgroups of the population. For example, it's pretty well established in the literature that men appear to be much more concerned about pay than women. Women enjoy working in the public sector to a much greater extent than men do. Young workers are less concerned with the length of the working day than older workers, particularly those with families. Graduates are more interested in responsibility and autonomy than non-graduates. Younger workers value perks such as free gyms, whereas older workers prefer company pensions and things like this. So there are big variations within the workforce about what contributes to people's well-being at work. Now, firms with an understanding of this can offer an appropriate mix of pay and other benefits to attract the groups that they're interested in attracting. But governments necessarily tend to go for one-size-fits-all solutions, which may end up satisfying nobody very much. It's also the case, I should add in passing, that people bring a great deal of baggage to the workplace, as those who've ever employed large numbers of people can attest. Personal problems at home can quite swamp the effects of a pleasant working environment. Conversely, of course, those lucky enough to have a positive, sunny outlook in their personal life can enjoy the most irksome of jobs. And indeed, there may be some degree of exploitation there, because often those people end up being put upon by employers because they're so willing to take on responsibility. Now, sensible recruitment by firms will try to match workers to jobs. This is very important. But nowadays, of course, government equality legislation, data protection, freedom of information legislation, and so on, make this increasingly difficult as they deny employers relevant information about candidates for jobs. And thus, this loads a cost on the employer of searching more effectively in other ways to try to find the right kind of employee. So it's no accident that with the growth of this kind of legislation that we get firms turning towards expensive things like assessment centres, use of headhunters and so forth. Because this match between personal characteristics and the nature of the job is obviously highly important. So that's the first thing then, that there isn't a set of things which uniquely produces well-being for all groups of the population. Turning to the second proposition, the empirical evidence which links productivity with happiness is not altogether persuasive. We know, for example, that close management supervision in routine jobs, this was referred to, I think, obliquely by Jesse, close management supervision in routine jobs seems to boost output, but makes people pretty fed up. On the other hand, there are plenty of examples of firms with extremely happy workforces going bust. And this is related, I think, to the issue about the bottom line. The point I'd reiterate really is that firms which are successful in boosting employee well-being can't necessarily do this for free. Higher pay, greater job security, high levels of training, generous pensions, all these things probably boost well-being for some workers, for many employees perhaps, but they clearly come at a cost. Does any increase in productivity which may occur offset this extra cost and therefore improve the bottom line? It's not clear. Is there also a danger of diverting managerial energy in the wrong direction? Business success or failure depends on many factors, the quality and contentment of the workforce being only a small part of the picture. I always quote the fact that in March 2008, the Royal Bank of Scotland was given an award for being the best UK employer for work-life balance. Many of its ex-employees are now finding that their work-life balance has shifted rather alarmingly. This is a good point to end on, for one of the clearest findings from the happiness and well-being literature is that unemployment makes people very unhappy indeed. Government intervention to promote well-being at work through greater employment protection, for example, is harmful if it makes firms less willing to hire people in the first place. Most other employment mandates are also costly and likely to deter recruitment, leaving outsiders who can't get the jobs unhappy. Such measures don't always produce much benefit for the incumbent workforce either. Restrictions on working hours, and here we might mention those which have recently been proposed by the New Economics Foundation. There's an interesting debate on an IAEA blog about this last week. New Economics Foundation wants to limit us all to 21 hours paid work a week. These things may force poorer workers into moonlighting with another employer, an outcome which is undesirable for many reasons. Or the well-being of some groups may increase at the expense of others. Enhanced parental leave, for example, has been shown in many cases to annoy non-parents who have to provide the cover for people taking time off. So I would finish by arguing that this is an area into which the government should be very wary indeed of treading. Thank you.
Well, I am from Yorkshire, but I assure you that my scepticism about David Cameron's Happiness Project is not based on my roots. From there, it's actually, I'm in principle, I don't think it's a bad thing for government to be concerned with happiness. I think it is as valid an objective as many other government priorities. But the fact that something is desirable is no good unless it's also practical. And I think that it's entirely impractical, and I don't see any policies that could be realistically used from the surveys that are going on, or any surveys that could be envisaged. I mean, the good news is that we have got a pretty good idea about what makes people happy. Studies over many years have pretty much confirmed what you can probably work out for yourself. The problem is that most of the things that make people happy are things the government can't do anything about. So people like to have a lasting marriage, they like to have children, they want a good sex life, they want sunny weather, they're happy if they have, you know, religious belief. Most of the things that improve well-being, happiness, call it what you will, cannot be affected by the government in the first place. And then there are things that can increase happiness, but which the government already does because it seems self-evidently right that they should do so. Just mentioned unemployment. Unemployment certainly, without any question, makes people less happy. We don't need a happiness survey to tell us that government action on unemployment is going to improve society, is going to improve the lives of people who are unemployed. This has been a priority for many years. Similarly, making the streets safer or educating people. Yeah, these things will improve happiness, but we're doing them anyway, and we always would do. And that also applies to some of the things that an institute like the IAEA find quite enjoyable about the happiness literature, because as it happens, a lot of the happiness studies confirm what places like the IAEA would like to see anyway. The studies tend to show that people actually enjoy and are made happy by living with a free economy, that they are happier through wealth, they're happier if GDP rises, they like strong governments that protect private property rights. But again, a case can be made for these things without having to resort to the happiness surveys. These things are a reward in themselves and don't need any added justification, I would argue. And then there are things that the government could do to make us happier but won't do, because they're effectively untouchable, because they clash with other priorities that government has. It's sometimes said, quite misleadingly, that modern societies are on this endless, narrow chase towards the limited goal of getting higher and higher GDP. This is something that the New Economics Foundation, for one, very much against, and they think we should be looking at other things. I mean, this is untrue for two reasons. I mean, one, chasing GDP is not in any case is not a narrow objective. I mean, money is only tokens for which you can buy any number of things to make you happy. It's the broadest possible objective if you're going to have an objective. And secondly, it's a straw man to say that any government ever focuses on GDP to the exclusion of everything else. There are a whole host of things that get in the way of GDP. There are a host of laws that are passed to pursue other objectives at the expense of GDP. There's any number of health and safety regulations, environmental regulations, regulations to try and chase equalities and all these kind of things, many of which actually hamper GDP, but it's considered to be a price worth paying for these higher goals. But the same constraints on GDP also apply to happiness. So, for example, if it's the case that I would be happier if I was allowed to sit in a pub playing cards for high stakes, drinking below-cost alcohol and smoking opium, or dare I say, smoking cigarettes, then that avenue of pleasure would be cut off to me, because it's believed, quite mistakenly, that I would be happier going down the local gymnasium or something, working on my biceps or something. So these are priorities that are already set in stone. I mean, it's fine for Richard Layard and people to say that the ultimate priority of government should be happiness, but that hope is in vain. There are clearly many other things that will take priority over that. Similarly, if it could be shown in these surveys, which it won't be because they're far too vague, but if it could be shown that people would be happier with the death penalty restored, or the abolition of the monarchy, or by leaving the European Union, again, there is going to be no conversation about that. So there are a number of things that might well make us happier, but which are untouchable, effectively, anyway. So that leaves a very small number of possibilities. I've been racking my brains trying to think of the kind of things that the government might bring in to make us happier, which aren't already covered by those three criteria. One thing that's a particular hobby horse of mine is British summertime, all year round. And it comes up every year. Is it a good thing, is it a bad thing? Personally, I think it would make people happier. And by people, I mean it would make me happier. It would make, and this is a problem with the happiness issue again. There's an element of redistributing it from one group of people to another. The British summertime, 365 days a year, would probably make a lot of people in Scotland, for example, and a lot of early risers unhappy, but to my benefit. But if we say unequivocally, let's assume that having British summertime round the year, would unequivocally increase the size of our national happiness, that kind of finding wouldn't come out in these surveys anyway, because the questions being asked in Cameron's happiness surveys are stupefyingly banal. It's things like, are you satisfied with your wife or husband? Did you feel cheerful when you woke up yesterday? And there is nothing useful I can think of that will come out of this, other than possibly just some spurious statistics of things like, you know, the happiest place in Britain is Newquay, or the happiest age to be is 52, or the most miserable place in the country is, well, whatever, you know, which has no policy implications at all. The figures themselves would be bogus. It will have no effect, except possibly to push up house prices in whichever town is said to be the most popular, most happy place. So I would say it's pointless. We do have a much better guide than these happiness surveys in finding out what makes people happy, and that is simply by witnessing what they do, where they work, how much, what they're prepared to do to earn, and what they do with the money when they've received it. And these revealed preferences tell us much more than any vague survey could do. The leftist hijacking of the happiness literature attempts to say that effectively that there's a huge market failure going on, and what people are doing with their money doesn't reflect what would make them happy, and that people are irrational consumers, and what they really want and what would really make them happy would be a zero growth economy and a more egalitarian society. And it's easy to work out why they're saying that. It's because the policies have always espoused are going to stagnate the economy and possibly make rich people poorer even quicker than it would make poor people poorer. It's, you know, no consumer is perfectly informed. We know this, but we have to accept that people's revealed preferences are a far better guide to what makes them happy than anything else. People clearly do pursue happiness, and we can see that in their actions. So in short, we know more or less what makes people happy. Most of the things that make us happy, the government is powerless to influence in the first place. The few things that it could influence, it won't be prepared to do because it clashes with their other priorities. Some of the things that make us happy, it's already doing with varying degrees of success. And in the unlikely event that this research highlights any new arenas of happiness that have hitherto been unexplored, it would be a miracle, because the surveys themselves are far too crude. And so on that basis, although I think it's a well-meaning objective, I have to say that I think it's a waste of time and money.
I'm going to take us from practicality to complete abstraction. Now there's been some discussion about terminology, happiness versus well-being. I'm going to introduce another concept, which I think is really the important one, which is welfare. Now, to simplify, there are broadly two conceptions of welfare within what you might call a utilitarian camp. There's the view known as preference utilitarianism. It's the view that your personal welfare is a matter of, roughly speaking, this isn't exactly right, but it'll do for tonight, satisfying your preferences. So your welfare increases insofar as you satisfy more of your preferences. This doesn't have any specific conception of what's good for you. It could be anything. It depends on you. It depends on what your preferences are. So it can vary a lot between people. Then there's what's sometimes known as the list conception of welfare, or the objective notion. This is the idea that there are certain specific things that are just good for you, whether you want them or not, whether they're your preferences or not. The reason it's called list is obviously you can list them. These are the things that constitute welfare. In fact, Amartya Sen and a philosopher called Martha Nussbaum have been pushing this view, and they've listed them. They've worked out what it is, and they've got a little list. Now, this is the happiness camp, Layard, implicitly the government survey. They are in the list school. They think that we can discover what welfare is, and that it doesn't depend, interestingly, on people's preferences. We can just get a list. Now, what I want to discuss is not so much which is right and which is wrong. I think the preference view is right. We'll discuss that later. But I wanted to show why we should be frightened of the list view by showing what's the connection between these two different views of welfare and liberty. So I once asked Madsen Pirie, when I first met him at Adam Smith Institute, I said, what's so good about liberty? And he couldn't answer that question. He just said, well, it's liberty. But if you're a preference utilitarian, you've actually got a very good answer as to what's so good about liberty. If I see somebody acting in a way that I find strange, right, I don't know why they're doing this. It looks to me like they're acting, let's call it irrationally. I've got two hypotheses. One is that they want the things that I want, they've got similar preferences to me, or and that they're mistaken about means to that end. Or I could take the view, well, they probably want different stuff from me, they may have different preferences, and what they're doing is actually good for them. As far as I know. I don't know. I can't tell just by looking at them whether they're doing the right or the wrong thing, whether they're acting in their own interests or not. If you're a preference utilitarian, that's how you see it, and you become a natural political liberal, because you know that third parties, especially distant ones like in the central government, cannot know which actions are in people's interests, simply because they cannot know what people's preferences are. So you very automatically, once you're a preference utilitarian, you become a liberal, a political liberal, and an individualist. That's, most of the liberals, through the famous liberals, people like Whyte even, that's roughly their philosophical position. If, on the other hand, you're a list utilitarian, if you pick out some particular things that you think that's what welfare is, that's utility, it's pleasure, let's say, it's rig me up to the hedometer and find out how much of it I've got. Once you have that view, then it's you're in a very different position when you look at people's strange behaviour. Because you know that their behaviour is not going to lead to that outcome, right? Let's suppose you know that. Well, then they're making one of two mistakes again. Either they don't know means to ends, they want what you want, they want happiness, but they don't know how to get there. Or they've got the wrong values, right? We get the concept now of having the wrong preferences. Your preferences are making you act against your own interest. Or the third thing is you're being coerced. There must be some coercion going on there. You're in a voluntary transaction, and yet it's not going to lead to the outcome that I, as an observer, think is the right outcome. So I'm inclined to see coercion where apparently voluntary things are going on. Once you're in that state of mind, that's how you think. You're not a liberal at all. You see error in need of correction all around you. And this is precisely where probably everybody in politics nowadays, on the left and on the new Conservative Party right, is. They see wrong preferences, irrational behaviour all around them. And they're devoting themselves to techniques. They're trying to discover techniques for correcting us. Nudge is the great fashion. Now, everybody thinks this is kind of benign and really rather nice. But I think the reason they think that is that, Dave is a benign, nice-seeming guy, and he just wants to nudge us. And you kind of don't take it seriously in a way. I mean, the little $2 million surveys, and I think it is all probably going to be harmless in the end, because, it's fatuous, really. But the state of mind, the ideas about welfare that lie behind this movement are pernicious. They are very, very dangerous ideas because they do really justify massive coercion, state coercion. It's just a kind of squeamishness that prevents Dave from, banning divorce. Right? I mean, he's worked out, why ban it, right? They've worked out that divorce makes you unhappy. And happiness is the goal. Ban it. Why not? I mean, what principled reason has he got not to ban it? If you're a preference utilitarian, you can work it out. Even if you're a utilitarian, right? You don't have to be a libertarian, you can be a utilitarian. You still really like liberty once you're a preference utilitarian. It's this crazy idea that we can know what's good for people, even when we don't know what their preferences are, that it's happiness and by the way, you know what they mean by happiness? They mean the Dalai Lama. All the happiness scientists say, if you want to know what we mean by happiness, we mean that kind of state of contentment and so on. I don't want that. I want a big house and a big car and stuff like that, and I know it's not going to get me to be like the Dalai Lama. And I don't mind. I don't even think it's going to make me happy in any way. I agree with them. Happiness does not come from material goods. But I want them. And I do not want them as a means to happiness. I want them for themselves. Right? Now, they think I'm insane. Guys like Layard say, you are insane, you need medical treatment. The government must intervene and stop you pursuing these perverse interests you have. He honestly says this, I'm not making this up. That is why this is very it seems like silliness, and we all, kind of the press covers the stuff as if it's all a bit of a joke. Well, let's hope it stays that way. Thank you.